Welcome on in, everyone. So, Dune Awakening had a bit of a combat reveal yesterday. They showed us some single player, some multiplayer combat, as well as some PvP combat. Now, I myself am a bit of a combat hoe. All I really care about in video games is how good combat is. Everything else is fun, don't get me wrong, but that is the icing on the cake for me. How much fun is combat in a game? So let's take a look at this Dune footage and talk about how good or bad this game is actually going to be. Also, the game's release has been pushed back to June 10th, June 5th, if you guys want to shovel out that money for early access. But the reason that they said they're pushing the game back is because they wanted to work on some concerns that players had during the closed beta. Now, past experience has taught me not to hold my breath about this, but hopefully that means they're going to be addressing issues people had with the gameplay and maybe combat stuff. So, let's talk about the gameplay. The first thing that I notice is that we've got melee and ranged combat in Dune Awakening. I'll be honest, I really like melee combat, but I often find in games like this, it is very hard for developers to balance melee and ranged combat appropriately, especially in a game like Dune, where we see lots of open space and lots of opportunity for ranged weapons to be very powerful. The way that they kind of combat this is by taking a kind of lore-friendly approach to how shields work in Dune. You can have your shield up 100% of the time while you're in melee combat, unless your opponent breaks it, of course. But when you're in ranged combat, you need to take your shield down in order to shoot your gun. So this means that you're much more vulnerable when you're fighting at a distance in ranged combat. And with melee combat, you can just have your shield up and be tankier and more aggressive in general. Now, keep in mind, this is just the devs playing their game for a showcase demo. We don't know what high-level combat in Dune will look like until people actually get in there and the meta starts to develop, etc. As you guys can see, we've got various different abilities in combat as well. You can have 3 active abilities slotted for your character, as well as 3 passive abilities. We'll come back to the Buildcraft portion of stuff at the end of the video once we're done all this combat gameplay, and we'll talk about putting those builds together so we can go a little bit more in depth. But for the most part, that is going to be the basis of your build, your active and your passive abilities. Then you have a few different resources that you need to manage while you're playing this game. The first one is hydration. Now, this isn't necessarily a combat resource because you don't use it while you're fighting, but the more hydrated you are, the more bonuses you get to stuff like your stamina management. So it definitely has an impact, and it emphasizes the player to want to stay hydrated as often as possible. And then when we look at the left-hand side there, you can see the red bar with the little bit of a shield cover over top of it. That is obviously the health / the shield bar. And then on top of it, we have the stamina bar, and below it is the energy bar. So your various abilities that you use and your dodges will pull from your stamina bar, whereas your shield and the abilities that you have equipped through your gear will pull from your energy bar. Now, this isn't a hard rule or anything. This is just what I saw in the various gameplay demos that I've seen. Needless to say, when I watch some of this footage, I see that not all of the players here are very great at managing their various resource bars. And I feel like when you're in combat, especially PvP combat, making sure that you manage your resources is going to be a huge deal. I imagine that you won't be in a great spot if you get caught with no stamina and someone's just wailing on you. And finally, the last kind of buff that we have, or resource, I guess, is the spice mechanic, which allows you to enter something called the prescient state, which is shown by the purple glowing eyes on the character that is being played right now. This just gives you increased combat abilities. I think it gives you better stam sustain. I'm sure there are more combat bonuses that it gives you on top of that, but for now, we just know that you have to consume spice in order to enter this state, and you'll be a little bit stronger when you're in this state. I'm sure we'll see something like a spice build as this game releases and people play around with the different mechanics and what you can and can't do. But for the most part, that kind of covers all the basics of combat in Dune Awakening. Now, I want to get a little bit further into it, though, and let's talk about the actual combat gameplay, what we can tell from watching the animations play out and how people are canceling in and out of things, how smooth combat is to transition between various things as well. This is crazy important. Whenever I watch gameplay footage, I look for things like downtime when you can't control your character. Maybe you just swung your sword and you have to wait a certain amount of time before you can roll and stuff like that. From my impressions watching the Dune gameplay, honestly, it seems like there is good potential to have very little downtime with the right combat setups. Again, I'll say this now, I'm not trying to rip on the devs or anything, but not all of the devs that are playing are utilizing those windows to the maximum extent. So, you know, the gameplay footage here that we see is from varying different levels of gameplay knowledge and gameplay ability, basically. But let's look at the sword fighting here. I do like how it seems like you can very quickly cancel out of your sword attacks with your dodge. Now, this guy is just getting bonked out a whole bunch. It looks like the big AoE pulse is an ability that the enemies can use that kind of mocks the player ability that you have, where it just kind of staggers your opponent, and they're locking this poor guy in a stagger chain, and his stamina is super low. Now, I gotta say, it looked like he had opportunities to outplay here, but instead of doing that, he just kept trying to swing his sword at point blank range, and he got locked in that stagger chain, didn't manage to regain any of his stamina, and goes down. So it seems like, you know, you can get punished big time for running out of resources and making mistakes, which is always great for any combat system. But what I do want to really note about that particular piece of footage is that there were a lot of tells for the moves that were coming. So it's not like he had no opportunity to react to them. He just simply did the wrong thing. One thing I also want to talk a little bit about is that ability bar. If you guys look at the bottom right-hand side, you can see that there are 8 different slots where you can slot not only weapons, but it looks like healing items and maybe other support items, maybe even stuff like grenades. I know there is a grenade ability, and there we see that again, that charge up ability. And this guy even has a dash, which he pops way too late after he already got hit by the stun. And yeah, I gotta say, you know, I haven't played the game myself, but judging by the footage here, it seems like we have devs that are a little bit slow to the punch, but if they were a little bit quicker on their toes, they could actually have some good outplays against those NPCs there. But yeah, you've got a lot of different weapon and ability options in your bar slots, so it seems like switching between weapons and switching between the right tool for the job is going to be a big deal for this game, at least giving you all of the different options you need to fight the various different things that you'll come by. And that goes especially for PvP gameplay. Having a more well-rounded kit versus focusing on one style of combat, I think is going to be super beneficial. Now, they did also mention armor weights during this preview. The only one they really talked about was light armor for increasing your dash and dodge capabilities. And they mentioned how the light armor is supposed to be a more melee-focused armor setup. So that's pretty interesting. Anyway, let's take a look at this part here. This is where the good stuff happens. We get to see a little bit of PvP combat. Now, I'm going to be harsh here. I'm going to scrutinize every mistake that the players make because it's super important in determining how good or bad this combat is going to be. So if we see somebody die because they made a mistake versus dying because a mechanic sucks, that is a super important definition, at least for me. So in this particular piece of gameplay here, they're in the PvP zone, and it looks like the 2 players on the outside of this door decided that they want all the loot to themselves, so they're going to kill the other 2 guys that they came in here with. And they both charge in with their guns shooting. I see a little bit of a screen put down. That's a big deal. It looks like this is something that's going to block or absorb bullets. So that's really nice for melee fighters. And then as soon as this guy gets in melee range, the guy just pulled his gun out and he takes a ton of damage having that shield down. So being aware of where your opponent is and spacing is super important. And there is a really nicely timed stab, it looks like, right as his opponent's kind of launching his attack, and I think he gets it off the parry on his sword. Now, there's not only blocking, but we get a parry mechanic as well, which gives you some bonuses after blocking, and I'm assuming being able to get that shield stab is one of them. And now we switch perspectives to a different player here, and this is the guy who, for lack of a better word, just spams. I mean, he's not really using his stamina bar, he's not using abilities, he is just spamming light attack with his sword, and we can see here, minus the 1 dodge he did to get behind his opponent, he is just getting beat in this fight. And I think that's just because timing is crazy important, and it's good to see that. It's good to see the player who just spams an attack get punished for it. But here you see he lands a nice stagger, and then he gets a couple hits off on his opponent. The other player quickly switches back and puts pressure on him, but it looks like the shields are doing a majority of the tanking here. Nobody's health bar has really been exposed. One thing I do notice is you don't get to see your opponent's health. You only get to see if their shield is up or not visually on their character. So it can be tough to know how close to dead an opponent is unless you've been fighting them and have a good idea of where they're at. And there we see that nasty stagger, and he goes for the stab. and he finishes off this guy here. And my money was on the other player for winning that fight, let's be honest. And there we go. That was unfortunately all the PvP combat that we got to see in this last preview, but we did get to see a little bit of the Buildcraft side of things. It looks like we've got a bunch of different archetypes to choose from, but there isn't going to be like a class system or anything in Dune at all. You're just pulling various different passives and active abilities from the different archetypes that you have and then slotting them on your bar. Taking a look at his ability bar, you can see that not all the abilities he has slotted are from this particular archetype. So I like that a lot. It means that Buildcraft probably has a decent amount of layers to it, and there's going to be some fun builds out there. For guys that like melee combat like me, it means that we're going to be able to put together one hell of a focused melee build, which is really cool, because that honestly was my biggest concern with Dune, is like, how am I going to play sword the whole time and only pull out my gun when I need to? And I mean, just judging from the gameplay we saw here, getting that knee dash, getting the other dash where you kind of back up, I don't know what it was called, but we saw one of the characters use it, and then getting that kind of bullet screen shield that they put up during the PvP fight, that's a great way to start with a melee kit right off the bat. So I like it. I feel like there's a lot of potential here, but at the end of the day, you know, we got to go in, we got to play, we got to see how the meta establishes, we got to see how things are balanced, and then we'll get a good idea of how good or bad this combat is going to be. But visually from the outside, it looks pretty promising, you know? We'll see what Funcom does with it. We'll see if they can smoothen it up a little bit. We'll see how it feels to play. I'd love to hear what you guys think. And of course, thank you so much for watching. I will be covering more Dune stuff as the game comes out, and then once it comes out, I'll probably play it quite a bit. So I'm excited for this one. And hopefully it's not a steaming pile of shit. We'll see how it goes. Have a great night, everybody. I'll see you next time.